Good morning. This is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to our next episodes of Work Matters with Pastor Will. This will represent 3 new episodes in Work Matters. This will be 9, 10, and 11. And we want to lift up here Jeremy Paul Myers. He's a professor at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he's the professor of youth family ministries where he lifts up discipleship with young people. And that's why we're so fascinated with his these 3 talks, because he lifts up a theme that we're all committed to, and that is the discipleship of youth, whether those are our children or our grandchildren or, well, kids around us that we really care about. And so the next 3 episodes, Pastor will lead us into this important discussion. The first will be on the good news and bad news surrounding youth. And they're surrounded by so much bad news, we want to understand that so we know how to preach Jesus to them, the good news of God. The second session will be on adolescents as undeveloped consumers versus called co-creators. And so there's a theological good news that the professor wants to bring to youth. And the third session will be entitled Adolescence, Understanding the History of Adolescence, How is it developed, and understanding how we can share with them the call of Jesus to be and to do now, not in preparing for the future necessarily, but how they can follow Jesus at this moment. This is a great conversation. Professor Jeremy Myers does a wonderful job. You're going to enjoy this. And so now we ask Pastor Will to lead us in this important discussion.
Thank you, Pastor Rick, as always. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Work Matters with me, Pastor Will. You are in the middle of a 3-part series from Dr. Jeremy Myers of Augustana University that is focused all on the vocation of our youth. And in this particular episode from Dr. Myers, he uplifts this profile that the culture has placed upon our youth, this profile that's known as an undeveloped consumer. And so in this short video, he lays out what this profile is in 4 short parts. I want you to make sure you pay attention to those keywords. I will review them after the video. And then he talks about, in a sense, how we transition from that into a greater calling known as co-creators, a vocation that we all share together as the body of Christ. So without further ado, I will leave you to the video. Enjoy Dr. Myers.
In this context of third secularity, we have there's a dominant way of thinking about our young people that I'm going to call the undeveloped consumer. And what I'm going to do is quickly go through the 4 characteristics that I think frame how we think about young people right now. And so the adolescent, this caricature that exists out there, this not real, false thing that we think all of our teenagers, this false box we think all of our teenagers fit into, I call the undeveloped consumer. Let me describe that, and then I'm going to give you a little history of where that came from. And then we'll offer an alternative. And the alternative, rather than thinking about our young people as undeveloped consumers, we need to shift and begin thinking about them as called co-creators. And hopefully you'll be as interested in this as you were in Charles Taylor's second. So the first characteristic, the first thing we assume about our young people is that they're undeveloped. And developmental psychology is the source of this. I have a background in child psychology. I agree with developmental theory. Absolutely, we are all developing in our life, either forwards or backwards. And every day we're fluid and dynamic constantly. Every person at every stage of life is changing and growing and evolving. If we think about our young people as undeveloped, what we're saying is that you're not yet fully human. You haven't yet fully arrived. You can't quite yet fully contribute because you're 12, because you're 13, because your brain, I hear this all the time. I hear this all the time in youth ministry circles. Well, their brains aren't fully developed until they're 25, and they use that as an explanation for why they made a bad decision, right? I'm like, well, I know some 50-year-olds who make some pretty bad decisions too, right? So but I hear people who are paid to be advocates and allies for young people saying that all the time. Is it true that the brain is not fully wired before they're 25? Yes. Does that mean they can't make good decisions? No. If I went to our stereotypes, right? The brain is there's this thing called plasticity. Your brain is even past 25, your brain can still learn new neural pathways, right? So the brain is constantly changing, but yet somehow we think that in the teenage years they're somehow undeveloped, and that's problematic. What the message we send to them is, you have nothing to offer yet until you fully arrive. And then they wonder, like, well, when is that? Because at one point, and we'll look at the history, at one point I was an adult as soon as I was strong enough to work, right, or bear children. And then all of a sudden I was an adult when I could drive, and then I was an adult when I could vote, and then I was an adult when I could buy alcohol, and then I was an adult when I got my first job. But now that doesn't happen until I'm 30, right? Or I'm not an adult until I get married, or I'm not an adult until I have kids. And that marker of adulthood just keeps getting further and further and further away from them. And so now we're essentially saying, well, even if you're 28, you haven't yet fully arrived. And that sends a message to them that, like, okay, I guess my role is to just stay in my parents' basement and play video games, because that's what they expect of me. Right? So that's problematic. That's one assumption we make about our young people. Another assumption is that they're identity-less. And again, I'm sorry if this is repetitive for people who were here yesterday, but Erik Erikson is a developmental theorist who talked about identity formation. He talks about crises, and that we have to resolve a crisis at every stage of life before we can move on to the next stage of life. If you don't constructively resolve a crisis, you can't move on to the next stage of life. You'll be kind of trapped in that previous stage. And so he said the crisis during adolescence is the crisis of identity. You have to know who you are before you can in a healthy way move out of adolescence. And so then a lot of the literature on identity really makes identity sound like this quest, this thing you have to go looking for, this thing you have to build, this thing you have to construct. It's an external thing. It's outside of you. You have to go find it. Is it under here? Is it over here? Or you have to somehow construct it and make it yourself. As a Christian community, we would say identity is actually a gift given to you, right? That God choosing you and coming into a relationship with you is the primary marker of your identity. Now the pressure's off you. And I have seen this message. I have a young woman, and I tell this story in my book, a young woman who was just a little pistol in my youth ministry in Valparaiso, Indiana. She's in Sarasota, I think now. She's down here, and was the president of her congregation. But man, but she was a great leader in our youth ministry. She was a high school student when I was working there. She was a great leader, and I loved her. Funny, witty, inappropriate as all get out. And she said, I love my Sunday night me. That's what she would tell me. I love who I am on Sunday nights when I'm at church, when I'm a small group leader. I love who I am here. And then I hate the Monday morning me. She was a bully at school. She had no patience for anyone. She kind of had a bad reputation at school for being snotty, kind of a bully, sort of. And she knew that, and she didn't like that, right? And so my mantra, her name's Erin, my mantra with Erin was like, Erin, just become who you already are. You're already the Sunday night. That's who you are. You're already this person, right? And you're the Monday morning you too. You're both of those things. But trust the Sunday night. Like, become who you already are. And that's what we get to tell young people. Identity is not this quest. It's not this hidden egg you have to go find. It's this gift that's been given to you. And the church community is there to remind people of it. The third assumption we make about young people is that they're self-centered, that they think that they want the world to revolve around themselves. Again, going to developmental psychology, there's this idea of egocentrism. Egocentrism tells us, we often think that what egocentrism is saying is that kids don't care about other people. They only care about themselves. But what it's actually telling us is that for the first time in their lives, they can take another person's perspective, right? So the brain, when they emerge into adolescence, the brain for the first time can take, I can for the first time in my life recognize that you have a different opinion of me than I have of myself. So when we say, what the science has told us is that young people are egocentric, and that's true. But what it means to be egocentric is that I recognize you all think differently about me. That it doesn't mean I want to be the center of the universe. It means that at any point in time, everyone in this room could turn and stare at me and have a different opinion of me. And that scares the bejesus out of me, right? and it's too much information. So like they haven't learned how to filter it. It doesn't mean that they don't, it doesn't mean that they're, so it doesn't mean that they're self-centered. It means that they're actually very in tune with relationships. They're very aware of other people and who's looking at them and how they're looking at them. They're very attentive to relationships. But we think about them as being self-centered. The fourth characteristic of the undeveloped consumer is that they're consumers. This assumption that the primary role they're supposed to play in society is that of consumer. Buy. Convince mom, dad to buy. Convince nanny or papa to buy. Right? The only way our young people feel they have any power in society is by how they get to spend their money. And so the only way they get to express themselves or have any kind of agency in this world is through the things they buy, through the things they choose to wear, the logos, the brands they wear, through the gadgets they have. Those are the only ways we've allowed them to express themselves and have any power, is as consumers. That's a really frustrating way when you don't have a lot of money. And Henry Giroux is an educational theorist who talks about some of this stuff. And he says that the young people who can't consume or won't consume, either because they're living in poverty or because they just want to be countercultural, then become considered disposable. So our young people living in poverty who can't participate in this way, they now have no agency whatsoever. And so then they're considered disposable because they can't participate in society the way society's been structured. So these are the four characteristics that I use to kind of describe the undeveloped consumer. And again, this is essentially not true, right? This is not true in that our young people, if I were to ask you if these words described a young person in your life you care about, you would probably say, no, absolutely not. Or you might say, well, sometimes, but not completely, right? So if the undeveloped consumer is the most powerful narrative, I would say right now in society about how we think about young people, and it shapes our practices with young people. It shapes the way we do education. It shapes the way we do youth sports. It shapes the way our churches do ministry with young people, because we think when we say, well, what do our young people want? We start thinking about them as a target market, as a niche market, and we start thinking about these words as things that describe them. So now how do we create programming that people like this would want? And if we're creating programming for people like this, and the people who are trapped in this box want to be liberated from this box, they're not going to want to come to our programming, right? Because they show up and it's just reinforcing. It's not liberating them. It's not good news. It's not gospel. They're not hearing hope. They're not hearing a new way forward. They're hearing the same old, right? And so if we're going to become relevant in the lives of our young people, it means we have to understand their bad news so we can proclaim Jesus to them in a way that will sound like good news. And if this is their bad news, and I think this is their bad news, and you can layer other things on top of this. You can layer poverty on here, right? So if this is their bad news and they're living in poverty, it exacerbates it. It makes it even worse. If this is their bad news and they have a learning disability, it exacerbates it. It makes it worse, right? So if that's their bad news, then how then do we start proclaiming it? And what do we do? How did we get here? That's what I want to do now. I want to, because I find this super interesting. And I mentioned this yesterday. Some of you in the room might be the first wave of teenagers in America, and so I like to do this history.
Wow, welcome back. What a short yet powerful video packed full of information that describes this profile of an undeveloped consumer, this profile that we as a culture have been impressing upon our teenagers and adolescents for almost 70 years now. And you know, what we're doing to our youth has a shapes how we interact and how we work with them in the future. Did you catch the key 4 words that describe this profile of an undeveloped consumer? That they're undeveloped, that the youth are undeveloped, as if everyone is not changing, growing and evolving themselves no matter what age they are. They're identityless. They don't have an identity, and then we as a culture make it seem like that they have to go on this quest to find their identity, and I can certainly relate to that in my own struggles of discerning what God has created me for, what God has set me out to do in this world, because I was receiving externally these expectations from the culture. And when I finally returned to church after a 10-year hiatus and back to my Lutheran roots, I discovered this notion of vocation and the idea that our identity is a gift to us from God, freely given. And I can tell you firsthand that how freeing that is, that the only expectations you have to live into is who you are as a created being from God. And you know, once you realize that as a young person, that next part, that self-centeredness begins to fade away. In a sense, like Dr. Meyer said, it was never really there. It was just those teens recognizing and learning that other people think differently than they do, that the world it works differently and is seen differently through different lenses of different people. And you know, that final 4th point that we place on our youth, they're consumers. And that if you can't be a part of this process of consumption, that you have no value, you have no worth in the world, when that is not true at all. We just talked about how your identity is a gift. And because of that, because you were created for a purpose, you have value, you have meaning in this world. And so, you know, what we're called to do as the church is make this shift from this undeveloped consumer into co-creation. And we know how to do this. We have the tools. We have the scripture. We have the catechism. Most of all, we have this gift of vocation that we as the church can share with our young people to build them up, not only preparing them for the world in a sense, but helping them to change the world, helping them to reflect a more evangelical light in a sense, to shine, to be that buried treasure and that hidden pearl that God has done everything for, given up everything for us. It's such a great series here with Dr. Myers. I could even go further, but we're going to save it for the next episode. So tune in next week to Work Matters with me, Pastor Will. We will see you then. Have a great week, and God bless.